The morning sun bounced off Whitmore Music Academy's gleaming glass windows, making the building shine like a monument of perfection. Students in pressed uniforms hurried across the courtyard, their instrument cases polished, their shoes spotless. Every step, every glance, screamed wealth and privilege. And then there was Malik Carter. His sneakers were scuffed, the laces frayed. His violin case, once black, was now scratched gray, its handle wrapped with duct tape. He held it tightly, like it might slip away if he loosened his grip. He knew the whispers were coming before he even stepped through the front doors. Look at that case. Did he pull that out of the trash? Bet he can't even play. The laughter was soft at first, but Malik felt each word burn against his skin. He kept his chin up, trying not to show it bothered him. But inside, his chest ached. He had dreamed of this place, Whitmore, the academy where the greatest musicians trained, as if it were heaven itself. Now it felt more like a trap. He found his way to the main hall, where auditions were being held. The space was massive, high ceilings with golden chandeliers, velvet curtains framing a stage that seemed to stretch forever. The air carried the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume. Malik had never been anywhere like this. At the center of the hall sat a long table. Behind it, teachers in elegant suits flipped through papers, barely looking at the nervous students filing in. Among them was Professor Helen Morrison, the head of the string department. Her reputation was legendary and terrifying. One glance from her cold eyes could unravel even the most confident musician. Malik tried to steady his breathing as he moved closer. He felt out of place in every possible way. The other students had shining violins, sleek bows, perfect posture. He had only his mother's old instrument, worn down from years of second-hand strings and too many hours of practice in a cramped apartment. When his name was called, a few students snickered. Malik's stomach tightened. He stepped onto the stage, and the spotlight bathed him in harsh white light. He could feel the weight of every stare pressing into his back. Helen looked up from her notes, her expression sharp. "Mr. Carter, is it?" "Step forward." Malik obeyed, his violin trembling slightly in his hands. Helen's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Let's see what you can do." The words weren't cruel on the surface, but Malik heard the challenge beneath them. This wasn't just an audition. It was a test. A chance to humiliate him in front of everyone. He swallowed hard, raised his bow, and placed the violin under his chin. His fingers felt stiff, his heart pounding so loudly he wondered if they could hear it. The hall grew silent. The laughter stopped. All that was left was Malik, and the first note waiting to be played. The silence in the hall didn't last long. Before Malik could even draw his bow, the whispers began again. They weren't soft anymore, they were sharp, cutting through the stillness like broken glass. "Look at his bow grip, wrong already. That violin looks like it belongs in a pawn shop. Why is he even here?" The students seated in the audience exchanged smirks and knowing glances. Their polished violins rested on their laps like trophies, each gleaming under the chandeliers. Malik's scratched case sat open at his feet, exposing the violin that carried years of wear, its varnish dulled, its bridge slightly uneven. To them, it was proof enough that he didn't belong. At the judges' table, some of the teachers scribbled notes without even looking up, as if Malik had already failed. Professor Helen Morrison, however, was watching closely. Her eyes narrowed, sharp and unblinking. She didn't need to say anything, her expression carried the weight of judgment. Malik tightened his grip on the bow. His chest burned, and his throat ached as though he had swallowed fire. He could feel the humiliation pressing down on him, heavier than the violin itself. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of one boy in the front row, a tall student with neatly combed blonde hair and a pristine navy blazer. The boy leaned toward his friend and whispered loudly enough for Malik to hear, "This is going to be painful." Laughter rippled through the rows. Malik's ears rang. He wanted to shout, to throw the violin down and storm out. But then he thought of his mother, who had pressed the old case into his hands that morning and whispered, "Play from your heart, Malik." That's what they can't take from you. The memory steadied him, if only slightly. Helen tapped her pen against the table, her voice cutting through the noise. Quiet. The room obeyed instantly. Her eyes locked on Malik. Whenever you're ready. The words sounded formal, almost polite, but Malik could hear the undertone, prove yourself, or prove me right. He swallowed, adjusted the violin under his chin, and lifted his bow again. His fingers were trembling, his palms slick with sweat. He took a breath, praying his first note wouldn't betray him. But as soon as the bow touched the strings, the sound cracked. A squeak, high-pitched and unsteady, echoed through the grand hall. The whispers exploded into muffled laughter, hands covering mouths, shoulders shaking. Malik froze. Helen's eyebrow arched, and one of the judges sighed, already scribbling something that Malik didn't want to imagine. His vision blurred, his confidence shattered. The humiliation he had feared was here. And he still had the entire piece ahead of him. The squeak of Malik's first note still lingered in the hall, sharper than any insult. His cheeks burned hot as the students' laughter grew bolder, spilling across the rows like wildfire. Helen Morrison didn't move. She simply tapped her pen once against the table, her expression unreadable. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter, a command to everyone in the room. Continue, she said. Her voice was calm, but Malik heard the challenge buried inside. Show us what you're really made of, or crumble right here. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might shake the violin from his hands. He wanted to run, to escape the spotlight, the whispers, the eyes waiting for him to fail. But his feet felt rooted to the stage. Malik raised the bow again. This time, the sound that emerged was slightly steadier, but still uneven, shaky like his confidence. The tall blonde boy in the front row leaned back in his chair, smirking. Told you, he whispered to his friend, not even bothering to hide his mockery. Malik's ears burned. Every wrong note felt like proof of their cruelty. He wasn't just being tested on his music, he was being tested on his pride. Professor Helen's gaze remained fixed on him. Her lips curved just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though she had already decided how this audition would end. Play the entire piece, she instructed, her tone firm. A murmur spread through the students. Usually, when someone faltered this badly, the teachers stopped them early, sparing them further embarrassment. But Helen wasn't sparing Malik. She was demanding more, forcing him to stumble through the full performance under every eye in the hall. Malik swallowed hard. He glanced down at his mother's violin, worn but familiar, and thought about the nights he had practiced until his fingers ached. He had played in his tiny apartment, in the silence of dark streets, on back porches where neighbors paused to listen. And yet, here, surrounded by chandeliers and marble floors, he felt smaller than he ever had before. He lifted the bow and tried again. The notes wavered but began to connect, stringing together fragments of melody. For a moment, he could almost feel the rhythm returning. Then someone coughed loudly, mocking the sound of his violin. More laughter erupted. Malik's bow slipped, breaking the flow again. Helen raised a hand, silencing the room. She leaned forward slightly. Do not stop. Continue. Her words struck him like a command carved in stone. Malik bit down on his lip until he tasted iron. He closed his eyes for a brief second. You don't get to humiliate me. Not without a fight. And when he opened them again, the bow in his hand didn't feel quite as heavy. The whispers had meant to break him. But instead, they had lit something fierce in his chest. Malik's bow hovered above the strings, trembling as if it shared his fear. The silence in the hall stretched long, filled with expectation and doubt. He drew a breath, lowered the bow, and let it glide across the strings once more. The first sound that came was thin, scratchy, like a bird caught in its own cage. A ripple of laughter moved through the students. Some covered their mouths, others didn't bother. Pathetic, someone whispered. Another voice followed, this is embarrassing. Malik's chest tightened. His shoulders sagged. Every mistake felt magnified under the weight of their stares, every squeak another nail in the coffin of his pride. He felt the sting of humiliation settling deeper, as if it had already carved his name into the Academy's memory, the boy who failed. Professor Helen Morrison sat at the center of it all, her expression unreadable, her pen resting between her fingers. She didn't stop him. She didn't even flinch at the broken notes. She wanted him to continue, to stumble again and again until the lesson of his inadequacy was complete. Malik adjusted his grip on the bow. His palms were slick, and his fingers cramped against the neck of the violin. He tried again, forcing the melody forward. The notes came, hesitant and uneven, tumbling over one another. The blond boy in the front row leaned back, smirking. "This is painful to watch," he said, loud enough for Malik to hear. The hall chuckled, and Malik's ears rang with the sound. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear entirely. But then, like a faint spark, he remembered the nights when he played alone in his room, when the world outside was too cruel and too loud. He remembered how the music steadied him, how every note reminded him of who he was, where he came from, and what he carried inside. He tightened his grip, closed his eyes, and drew the bow again. This time, the sound wavered but didn't break. The notes stretched longer, fuller, vibrating through the air with something raw, something real. The laughter quieted, just for a second. Malik felt it. A thread of strength, fragile but alive, weaving its way into his music. He held on, coaxing another note, then another. They weren't perfect. They weren't polished. But they were his. Professor Helen tilted her head ever so slightly, her pen tapping once against the paper. Malik didn't notice. He didn't notice the stares, the whispers, the ridicule waiting to pounce. For the first time since stepping into the hall, he wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself, for his mother, for the boy who had practiced until his fingers ached, for the dream that had carried him through every locked door and every sneer. The first true notes had begun. And though the room didn't yet know it, everything was about to change. The air in the hall was heavy, every breath thick with judgment. Malik's hands trembled, but the faint thread of melody he had managed to pull from his violin still lingered, fragile yet alive. For a heartbeat, the laughter had faltered. Then it crept back, softer but still there, waiting for him to slip again. Malik swallowed hard. His bow shook as he raised it once more. He could hear every stifled chuckle, every whisper bouncing against the marble walls. They weren't just mocking his music, they were mocking him. His skin, his background, the fact that he dared to stand here at all. His chest burned with anger and shame, colliding in a storm that threatened to tear him apart. He wanted to scream, to drop the violin and run. But then, from somewhere deep inside, his mother's voice surfaced. "Close your eyes, Malik. Let the world disappear. Play only what you feel." He squeezed his eyes shut. And in that darkness, the hall faded away. The whispers dissolved. The chandeliers, the velvet curtains, the smirks of the polished students, all of it vanished. What remained was the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He drew the bow across the strings again, and this time the note rang clearer. Not perfect, not polished, but rich with something no audience could mock, his truth. He leaned into it, his body swaying with the rhythm. Memories flooded him, his mother humming while cooking dinner, the hum of traffic outside their small apartment, the faint gospel songs that floated from church on Sunday mornings. Each memory carried a note, and each note carried him further away from the fear that had bound him. The violin began to sing. Soft at first, like a whisper of pain, then stronger, like defiance growing against the odds. The melody poured from him, unshaped by textbooks or elite lessons, but born of nights filled with struggle and hope. Every stroke of the bow bled with emotion, loss, longing, love. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The laughter had stilled completely now. Some leaned forward, frowning as though they couldn't quite understand what they were hearing. Professor Helen's pen stilled on the page. Her cold eyes narrowed, not in mockery this time, but in focus. Malik didn't see her. His eyes remained shut, his world still sealed. He played like the stage was empty, like the chandeliers and velvet curtains were replaced with cracked walls and flickering street lamps. He played as though the violin were the only voice he had, and for the first time in his life, it was being heard. The sound swelled, filling the cavernous hall, wrapping itself around the very people who had come to laugh. The sharp edges of humiliation softened, transformed into something undeniable. When Malik finally opened his eyes, the silence in the hall was different. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was stunned. The silence that filled the hall was no longer cruel. It was charged, expectant, as if every person inside had forgotten to breathe. Malik didn't notice them. His eyes were still half closed, his body swaying with the rhythm only he could feel. His bow moved with newfound steadiness, each stroke unlocking a deeper resonance from the worn violin. The notes rose, no longer scratchy or broken, but alive, aching with sorrow, pulsing with strength. His music painted pictures words could never reach, the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, the weight of nights when the lights were cut off, the laughter of children playing under street lamps, the soft comfort of his mother's lullabies. Every sound carried a story. At first, the students didn't understand. They had been trained to value perfection, clean intonation, flawless technique, polished posture. Malik's playing wasn't perfect. His fingers slipped sometimes, the bow tilted slightly off. But within those flaws was something none of their rehearsed performances had ever touched: soul. One girl in the second row, who had smirked at him earlier, now leaned forward, her lips parted. Her violin rested forgotten on her lap. Another student who had been laughing minutes ago sat frozen, his expression clouded with something close to shame. Professor Helen Morrison shifted in her chair. Her pen, which had been poised to capture every mistake, now lay motionless on the table. Her eyes tracked Malik's movements with growing intensity. She couldn't deny what she was hearing. The boy she had expected to collapse under the weight of humiliation was commanding the entire hall without even trying. The melody deepened, twisting into something rawer, more urgent. Malik's bow danced faster, his body moving with it as though the violin were breathing through him. The sound climbed higher, trembling on the edge of breaking, then descended into a low, aching hum that pulled at the heart. And for the first time since the audition began, the hall was utterly, reverently silent. Even the blond boy in the front row, the one who had mocked the loudest, sat stiff, his smirk gone, his gaze locked on the stage. He couldn't laugh now. He couldn't even move. Malik's music had stripped away every barrier. It spoke to something human, something fragile, that none of them could deny. For Malik, the hall was gone. He wasn't in Whitmore Academy anymore. He was back in his mother's kitchen, the smell of cornbread in the oven, her soft voice urging him to keep practicing. He was on the cracked front steps of his building, playing for neighbors who clapped along. He was everywhere he had ever been, and nowhere at all. And as the final notes of his phrase lingered, trembling like the last flicker of a candle, the silence in the hall felt heavier than any applause. Malik lowered his bow slowly, his chest rising and falling. His eyes opened. The room was still frozen. No one was laughing anymore. The last note hung in the air like a fragile thread of light, refusing to fade. Malik stood motionless, bow trembling slightly in his grip, afraid to breathe and break the spell. For a moment, the hall was so quiet that he could hear the faint hum of the chandelier's bulbs. Then, slowly, the silence shifted. Not with laughter. Not with whispers. With something heavier, something he had never expected. A sharp sniffle. It came from the judge's table. One of the older professors, a stern man with silver hair and glasses perched on his nose, pressed a handkerchief to his eyes. His shoulders shook, his composure cracking. Malik blinked, stunned. He wasn't the only one. A few rows back, a girl dabbed at her cheeks, her polished violin forgotten in her lap. The boy in the front row who had mocked him so loudly before now sat stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening as though fighting against something he couldn't control. Malik lifted the bow again. He didn't think. He didn't plan. The music simply poured out. This time the melody swelled, rich and full, rising like a tide that refused to be stopped. It carried grief and resilience, sorrow and hope, each note digging deeper into the listeners' hearts. The hall, built for perfection, had never heard something so raw, so painfully honest. Professor Helen Morrison's hand gripped the edge of the table. Her cold composure had cracked too. Though she tried to blink it back, her eyes betrayed her, shining with moisture. Her pen slipped from her fingers, forgotten on the paper. The sound of Malik's violin cut through every wall, every barrier of pride or privilege. It didn't matter that the violin was scratched or that his bow wavered slightly. The truth of the music was undeniable. It reached the places technique never could, the hidden wounds, the silenced pain, the fragile hope buried deep in every human heart. By the time he reached the crescendo, the hall was transformed. Students who once laughed now sat humbled, their eyes wet, their faces pale. Teachers who prided themselves on discipline and restraint struggled to hide their trembling hands. The melody softened again, falling into a tender close, like a lullaby whispered in the dark. Malik's bow slowed, his breath steadying with the final, aching note. When the sound faded, the silence returned. But it was no longer cruel. It was reverent. Malik lowered the violin, his arms heavy, his chest heaving. For the first time since he had stepped into Whitmore, he felt taller, not because he had proven them wrong, but because he had proven himself right. Across the room, Professor Helen blinked quickly and looked down, trying to compose herself. But Malik had seen it. Everyone had. His music had brought the room to tears. The final note dissolved into silence, yet the weight of it lingered, pressing against every person in the room. Malik stood frozen on the stage, bow lowered, unsure what to expect. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he saw it, faces, once twisted with mockery, now softened, pale, humbled. The same students who had laughed at his old violin now sat straight-backed, their polished instruments resting useless in their laps. The blond boy in the front row, the loudest voice of ridicule, kept his gaze down, his smirk long gone. His fingers twitched restlessly, as though ashamed to even hold his perfect violin. The hall, once buzzing with arrogance, had been stripped bare. Malik hadn't just played music. He had exposed them. He had peeled away the false confidence, the polished perfection, and revealed what none of them had ever admitted: they had technique, but no soul. One girl in the second row blinked rapidly, her cheeks streaked with tears. She had been one of the first to laugh when Malik walked in, but now her eyes followed him with something close to respect. From the judge's table, a professor cleared his throat, trying to disguise the shake in his voice. Another leaned back in her chair, dabbing at her eyes. And at the center, Professor Helen Morrison sat very still, her jaw tight, her pen lying useless beside her papers. Malik's chest rose and fell, each breath heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't played for their approval, not really. He had played because he had no other choice, because it was the only way to silence their cruelty, to prove that his mother's old violin carried a voice worthy of being heard. And now the silence spoke louder than any applause. A few students shifted uncomfortably, guilt etched into their faces. The weight of their laughter seemed to hang over them, souring in the quiet. They had tried to break him, but it was their pride that had cracked instead. Malik tightened his grip on the violin, his chin lifting. For the first time since stepping into Whitmore, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel out of place. The stage that had threatened to swallow him now felt like it belonged to him. Professor Helen's eyes met his. For the briefest moment, the steel in her gaze softened, replaced by something he couldn't quite read: respect, perhaps, or the unwilling recognition of a truth she couldn't deny. The hall had been transformed. Not by chandeliers or velvet curtains. Not by the wealth or prestige of Whitmore Academy. But by the sound of a boy with an old violin who refused to be silenced. Malik didn't need to hear the applause. He had already won. When Malik stepped off the stage, the silence still clung to the hall like smoke after a fire. The students sat stiff, their eyes following him as if unsure what they had just witnessed. No applause. No laughter. Just stunned quiet. A teacher led him to the side, telling him to wait outside while the faculty deliberated. Malik sat on a bench in the dim corridor, his violin resting across his lap. His palms still tingled from the performance, his chest aching with the weight of what he had poured into the music. He had no idea if it would be enough. Inside the judging room, the debate began almost immediately. "This is absurd," one professor snapped, tossing his pen onto the table. "His technique is sloppy, his intonation uneven. Whitmore demands precision. We cannot lower our standards because of one emotional performance." Across the table, another teacher leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Sloppy? Did you even hear him? That boy played with more soul than half the students in this academy. Technique can be taught. What he has cannot." Professor Helen Morrison sat at the head, her arms folded, her gaze sharp as the others argued. "He lacks polish," the first professor insisted. "Our reputation depends on producing the best, and the best are flawless. And yet none of our flawless students have ever made this room weep," the woman countered. "Admit it, he reached you too." The room grew tense. Several of the teachers shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to acknowledge the tears they had hastily wiped away only moments earlier. Helen's voice finally cut through the noise. "Enough." The room fell silent. She tapped her fingers against the table, her expression unreadable. We all witnessed what happened. The boy was mocked, unprepared, holding an instrument that belongs in a pawn shop, and yet he commanded the hall. You call his performance flawed. I call it undeniable. One of the younger professors spoke softly. "I've taught here 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. That kind of presence, it's rare." "But Helen," the stern professor protested, "Whitmore is not a charity. If we admit him, what message does it send? That anyone with a sob story and raw emotion can replace discipline and training?" Helen's eyes narrowed. "No. The message it sends is that music still matters. That it's not just about polish or money or perfection, it's about truth. And today, that boy told the truth in a way none of us could ignore." The room fell into silence again. Some of the teachers still looked doubtful, but the shift was undeniable. Finally, Helen leaned back in her chair, her decision etched into her voice. "Bring him back in." The heavy oak doors creaked open, and a teacher stepped into the corridor. Malik stood instantly, gripping his violin case as though it were the only thing tethering him to the ground. "They're ready for you," the teacher said. Malik's legs felt like lead as he followed, each step echoing on the polished floor. His mind raced, flashes of his mother's tired smile, the nights he'd practiced in their cramped apartment, the laughter of the boys who had mocked him. When he entered the hall, the silence was suffocating. The panel of teachers sat in a row, faces stern and unreadable. His heart pounded as he forced himself to stand tall, though inside, he felt like he might collapse. Helen Morrison's gaze locked on him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she folded her hands and spoke. "Malik," she began, her voice steady but not unkind, "this academy has seen countless auditions. We've heard flawless scales, perfect phrasing, technical brilliance. But very rarely do we encounter something unforgettable." Malik swallowed hard, unsure if she was building him up just to tear him down. "Your playing is raw," she continued. "Unrefined. There were mistakes. But what you gave us today was more than music. It was a story. A cry. A piece of yourself. And that is something no textbook or polished exercise can ever teach." A murmur rippled through the hall. Malik's breath caught in his throat. Helen's eyes softened. This school was built on discipline and tradition. But without soul, discipline means nothing. You reminded us of that today. Which is why, she let the silence hang for a beat, the suspense thick as fog. You have earned your place at Whitmore Academy. The words struck him like lightning. For a second, Malik couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes, and he clutched his violin case to his chest as if it were part of him. The room erupted, not with mockery, not with laughter, but with something new. Applause. Scattered at first, then swelling, echoing through the hall until it filled every corner. Even the students who had mocked him earlier now clapped, some with awe, others with shame on their faces. Malik bowed his head, overwhelmed, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't supposed to belong here. Not in this place of polished marble and perfect uniforms. But somehow, he did. Not because of where he came from, but because of the music that lived inside him. Helen's voice cut through the applause one last time. Remember this moment, Malik. Technique will come. Discipline will come. But never let anyone take away the fire you carry. That is what makes you extraordinary. As the applause thundered on, Malik lifted his head. His tears sparkled under the stage lights, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a musician.